This is a very, very, very rough sketch of what I'm going to be making next. And what it is going to be a soccer trophy. A coach in Indiana reached out to me to make a trophy for the hardest working player on his team. And her nickname is the HoneyBadger, which is suiting because that is the name of our business. And he kind of said to run with it and have a little fun with it and make something unique, not necessarily a typical trophy that you see. So basically the rough ideal I have going forward is going to be sort of an elevated platform with a wooden soccer ball right on top and a honey badger sitting on top of that soccer ball. The bulk of this build is going to be making this wooden soccer ball. I'm going to be making it out of hollow pentagons and hollow hexagons, and those are obviously the shapes used to make a soccer ball. And I'm making these shapes hollow because I want to skin this with a very thin wooden veneer and turn it into a lighted trophy. So I kind of did a little research online. Math is not my strong suit, and instead of sitting here and trying to figure out the math to making these balls, it was just easier to find it online, and I found online pretty much exactly what I wanted to make. And he also had some pretty detailed instructions with some photos of how he made it. Mine's going to be a little bit different than his, but I will put a link in the description of the original design from him so you can reference it as well as if you want. So he made his out of 1/2-inch plywood. I'm going to be making mine out of 1/2-inch MDF just because his was more of a showpiece with the skeleton of the soccer ball. Since I'm going to be covering mine, MDF is just going to be, since I'm going to be covering mine, I wanted to use something that is the least likely to be affected by relative humidity, as well as the fact that once you build this, the shape itself is fairly angular. To get it circular, you're going to have to do a little bit of sanding, and it's much, much, much easier to sand down MDF than plywood on edge. This is my MDF, and the first thing to do is you're going to be cutting this into strips, and each edge is going to be cut on a bevel to form your two shapes, your hexagons and your pentagons. And the pentagons, you need 12 of them, and the hexagons, you'll need 20. Now, in the example I saw, he cut his strips into 2 1/8 inch to give a little bit bigger than a regular size soccer ball. If you want a regular size soccer ball, he suggested cutting the strips at 1 7/8 inches. I want mine to be a little bit smaller than that since this is for a kid. They probably don't have a ton of their own shelving space or even room space, so I don't want it to be gigantic. So I'm going to cut mine at 1.5 inches. And for the hexagons, you're going to be setting your blade at 30 degrees, and for the pentagons, you're going to be setting your blade at 36 degrees. This is about a 22-inch piece of 1/2-inch MDF, and that's what I'm going to be using for my strips, which will give me enough to make the whole ball and maybe a little bit more. And that's what I want just because this is my first time doing this. It is a lot of math, and you're most likely going to have to tweak or even adjust some pieces, so it's nice to have some extra. So there's my pile of strips for my hexagons. I ended up cutting an extra one because that first one's probably a throwaway strip. It's hard to get an accurate cut once you have that skinny strip and you have to put 2 sides on that first one. So then I changed my blade down to 30 degrees. I kept my fence in the exact same spot. I'm going to cut 5 strips for the pentagons, and my strips actually turned out to be about a little less than 1.5 inches, which isn't going to be a problem. I think I'm going to err on the side of smaller for the soccer ball for this. So I went to go glue up my hexagons after I glued up that big pentagon, and I realized just by looking at it that these strips are much thinner than the pentagon strips, and that's because I didn't move my fence between the cuts. Since I changed the degree of the blade, it cut, even though I kept the fence in the same spot, it cut these narrower. So I'm going to have to go back. So I let my tube set overnight, and now I'm going to take all the tape off and sand all this glue off. I used a liberal amount of glue on this because MDF will really suck up the glue into the pieces that you cut, and because it's also very easy to sand glue off of MDF because the surface is so smooth. So I'm going to take this tape off and sand these and then start cutting them into their pieces. I ended up gluing even the wrong size of those hexagons just because I had them. There was no reason to just throw away the scraps. I glued them up, and maybe I'll use this tube for something else. I'm going to be slicing these tubes into 1/2-inch slices, and I put my cross-cut sled on here with a 1/2-inch stop so I could just slide them through. The only thing that kind of sucks about using the cross-cutting sled is it raises the height 3/4 of an inch, so it won't cut fully through this chunk, and I'll have to rotate it. But the accuracy on this is worth the extra cuts. So I went through and I cut the hexagon that I don't need just for practice, and these are the chunks you're going to end up with. And you could see with that glue how strong it is when you pull on it. These do not want to come apart. My piece is sliced to size. I could start measuring and cutting the side angle, also called the dihedral angle, and that is what is going to take these shapes from 2-dimension and form it into a ball. So what I have here is a scrap piece of 1/4-inch MDF, and I have one of my pieces. Now some of my pieces you could see towards the corners they separate a little bit. I don't think this is going to be that big of a deal because this for me is basically a skeleton that I plan on covering with something else. So you're definitely going to have some room for play and patching and glue. If you were doing this and you wanted this to be a showpiece where the skeleton is the final piece, I would definitely take more time and care to get these angles perfect by planing your work beforehand, jointing your work beforehand, and starting off with much more square, straight stock. MDF is pretty good, but I've had this for a while, and it wasn't perfect coming out of the box. So what I did was I took one of my nicer ones and I traced that inside, and I'm going to cut that inside out perfectly to fit over these, and then this will be mounted to something with the angle on my saw so I could put all these on and know I'm cutting that angle at the exact same spot. So now that I have that trace, and I'm going to do the same thing for the hexagons, I could cut these out. In order to cut all the precise angles on these, the first thing I'm going to have to do is find that angle. And the angle I got offline for the hexagons are going to be 20.9, and for the pentagons it's going to be 18.7. Now you could see, since these are not perfect hexagons, like I said, there are some spacing, that my piece fits in there pretty well, but it's tight in some spots, and I'm just going to give this a go because, like I said, I am going to be covering this, so if not all of my angles meet up perfectly, that's not a big deal for the design I have. So in order, I'm going to cut the hexagons first, and I cut about 10 extra of these, so I think I'm going to cut the hexagons and then cut a couple pentagons and see if these angles are correct. But the way I got this to 20.9 is I don't have one of those nice magnetic angle finders you could attach to this, so I set my angle on my gauge to about 21 and backed it off a little bit to get about 20.9. Then for my jig, I have a piece of 1/2 inch MDF that I could attach my little hexagon template to, and I just attached a scrap piece of wood so I could attach it to my miter gauge, so I know that this is running through at exactly 90. I'm just going to run the edge through and get an angle. Now, in order to figure out what this angle is, I have a sliding bevel with a digital gauge on it. So I could take this out of my table saw, put it on edge, and then use a square, since this is cutting your 20-degree angle, with my gauge set to 20.9, I could test that on there. And it lines up just about perfectly. So I'm going to start test cutting some of these hexagons. So I have that angle cut. Now I'm going to put my template in my hexagon, line it up with the edge of the top of that cut, and sink a few brads in here, and then I should be able to move and twist this and cut angles, identical 20.9 angles on all these hexagons. So for that first run through, you could see that my hexagons were kind of, especially just one side really sticks on that template. So I went through and I put a little paste wax around the edges, and now it seems to be moving pretty well. So I'm going to cut 4 more of these and try and fit them together to see if this angle is close enough for my project. And just a heads up, if you're making this out of MDF, you should always be wearing some sort of respirator. I always don't wear one, but you really should if you don't have dust collection. But with this stuff, I definitely always wear something because it just really clogs all your respiratory system up if you don't use one. So after I cut those 6, I taped them together, and you could see they fit really well. There's one little gap left, which will probably get smaller as I actually tape them. You could see just by squeezing it, it kind of disappears. These are just roughly taped, but I definitely think that I have set up on my table saw is going to work well enough for this. And you could take one of your pentagons and see that it's going to fit in that space for it once the angles are cut just about perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all of my hexagons, even the spares, and then adjust this setup to cut the pentagons. So I cut all my pieces and taped them together, and this is what I'm left with. And except for that one original gap, this fit together really nicely, which means one of these is probably just misshapen, and I could swap it out with one of my spares, but in general there's really no gaps. So in general, for the purposes I am making this for, I actually don't think I need to cut and insert these pentagons. I think I could get away with using this ball just as it is, since the pieces I would be putting on this would cover the whole piece. It would still look the size it's supposed to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch up my jig and cut one of the pentagons just to make sure the measurements I have are accurate. So if you want to continue building this fully with all of the other inserts, you can. I think I'm going to cut mine and then decide down the line during glue up if I want to glue it together. So in order to cut those pentagons, all I'm going to do is take my jig, I'm going to flip it and follow the exact same process with testing out my angle and finding the right one and then going from there. So for the pentagons, the angle's 18.7, and I just followed the exact same process as for the hexagons. I set this to 19 and then slowly backed off the blade, did a test cut, and then measured it with my digital bevel gauge until it got about where I want it to be. Then I could put the template already cut with this right up to that edge and attach that template. Now the nice thing about the pentagon, now that I have everything set up, is I should be able to cut one of these and see if it fits in the soccer ball to know if these measurements are accurate. You can see that after I cut that, it fits in my open spaces just about perfectly. Once these are all attached solidly, that it fits in there very nicely. So in order to, I am kind of on the fence about if I want to put all these in. So you only need 12 pentagons. I'm just going to cut probably 15 or 16. So if I need them, I have them. And if I don't need them, I could use them for something else. The angles on this are so good that I was able to take those cut pentagons and just put them in there, except for this bottom one, and to see what that ball would look like. And I'm still on the fence about how I want to proceed. And this has a pretty long timeline, so I think I'm going to set this aside, think about it for a day or two, and then come back to this. I'm ready to glue this ball together, and I'm going to be using all the pieces and make a complete ball. I have everything set up. I have glue ready to go. I'm just going to be using glue and tape. I cut a bunch of pieces of tape and have them lined up and ready to go. And all I did for that was I took an inch roll of tape and I used an X-Acto knife to cut a center line through the middle, and then you could cut thinner strips. They come off in thinner strips like that. So I'm just going to go around and I'm going to make 2 sets of the 6, and then you have to slowly piece it together one piece at a time. And I read a couple people say that gluing it up in segments is not great, just because it's really hard if you have 2 separate segments to get it all fit together. So I'm going to try and glue this whole thing up in one shot.